The work on Islamophobia has been going on for at least, 30, 40 years now, I think. There are different kinds of iterations of it. One of the first instances of the use of Islamophobia that many people would know about is in 1985 in the second edition of Edward Said's Orientalism. But my colleague Abdul Karim Vakil has done a lot of work looking at the genealogy of how that term emerges in different places, in different contexts, tracing it to the mid-19th century, the use of the word Muslim phobia by a civil servant working in the British Raj. So there are different things, but it's not so much the word, it is the work that the concept does at different moments in time. The same word can mean different things at in different places. So we have to be careful that we just don't have this illusion of trying to find the word when it's actually the work that it's doing. The meaning of a word depends on its usage, not on its etymology. This is why a lot of the criticism you get about Islamophobia is that, oh, it's the wrong word because phobia means fear, and Islam, isn't about Islam, it should be Muslim phobia, etc. These are rather, I would say that right now they're rather ridiculous kind of objections, which completely misunderstand how language works. The meaning of words isn't derived simply from how they're put together. The meaning can change, it does change over time, and it's really about how the words are used. So for example, no one has said, when people say Islamophobia is a medical condition, and therefore it should not be used, I've rarely seen these people say we shouldn't use the term xenophobia because that's a medical condition, because they don't think of xenophobia as a medical condition. So it's just the choices that they're making. So a lot of the debate about delegitimizing Islamophobia by saying it's the wrong word seems to assume that if you had the right word, it would be like some sort of magic spell and all the problems would go away. The problems that Muslims face in the world are not to do with the right word. And the attempt to try and find the right word is a distraction at best, and I would say at worst, it is part of the problem of Islamophobia itself.
When you started working on Islamophobia, at what stage was it? And I think you have worked on it for a couple of years. Now, at what stage it is?
I think when early work on Islamophobia tended to be come often from people who were studying racism, or people who were studying ethnic minorities. It tended to be work which was focused around ethnographies, a lot of empirical studies, and psychology. It was those kinds of studies about Islamophobia that were prevalent. And didn't really connect with a lot of the kind of thinking about racism as a form of governmentality, as a form of regulation related to colonialism as well. It didn't do all of that work. So it was basically in the mindset, well, here is a group of people, they're suffering discrimination, and the discrimination must be because they are Muslim, and these are the markers of Muslims, and these are the markers of discrimination. And that was a lot of the work there. I think what's happened since then is that while that still carries a lot of the work that's done, it's also been joined by legal studies which look for kind of legislative answers, etc., discriminatory practices and all of this. So that's another area which is dominated. But there has been a move to try and think of Islamophobia as belonging to the family of racialized and colonial differences, and that I think has been quite important. And so the post-colonial and decolonial inputs into the study of Islamophobia are probably the things that I think have transformed the field the most.
There's a world order that came after the Second World War, to say, like, to put a tag on it. How did Islamophobia influence that world order, and what is the implication of it?
So I think it's really important that you ask this question, because one of the things that has been quite useful has been trying to move away from the kind of local ethnographic studies to national studies, to actually thinking about it as an international phenomenon. So I was involved in a book, I think 2010, on the global perspectives, thinking through Islamophobia, global perspectives. And it was one of the earlier attempts to think of Islamophobia outside its framing, as this is what's happening in England, this is what's happening in France, this is what's happening in the United States, and try and see it global, both in the sense of different regions in the world, but also global, that it went beyond simply considerations of religious minority or religious discriminations, that there were many different ways that Islamophobia manifested itself. And I think that was quite significant. Now, that really links onto the question of the world order and international system. I often write about Islamophobia as being a grammar of the world order. And like a grammar, which basically tells you how to put things together, grammar is rules for putting things together. So we know that in different languages, certain things are put together in certain sequences, otherwise they're not intelligible. And in a way, what I wanted to say with that is that Islamophobia puts certain things together to make them intelligible. So take the category of terrorist. The way that you put together terrorist now, and the way that it's linked with Muslim, means that a number of things are possible. Now, we have the category of terrorist because we no longer have a category of freedom fighter. With the end of the Cold War, the category of freedom fighter and national liberation struggle disappears. So this creates a challenge for those ongoing struggles for liberation, but it also means that terrorism now exists, even though you could argue that the existence of what may be described as terrorism is a testimony to the closing of political channels for any kind of restitution, any kind of justice. So the idea of the world order and the different kinds of configurations of the world order, I would say that you have seen the way in which Islamophobia becomes not only the way that we understand the world, but how we actually practice the way that certain things are put together. So take, for example, airports. Wherever you go on the world now, there is a certain way in which Muslimness is policed going through airports. And it doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or not a Muslim, whether you say your prayers 5 times a day or you drink or whatever. There is a way that it's done. Some cases, like in France or Britain or the US, the people who are doing it may be Muslims. They may be, in some senses, better Muslims than you. So how do you explain that? You explain this because they're trained to look out for certain things. So we know that, for example, if you are from South Asia, you can tell if someone is from South India or East India or North India. People who are not from South Asia can't necessarily make that distinction because they're not trained how to do that, right? In the same way now, there was a point where Muslimness wasn't detected, wasn't eligible. People wouldn't see it. Now you have a situation, a whole bureaucracy in, let's say, airport security, which has been trained to read Muslimness. So, and this has happened in the last, 2 decades or so. So the point about the international order is that it works on particular kind of logics. If you talk to police forces and you talk about terrorism, you will find that often they will use Muslims as an example. There are notorious examples where there was a police exercise and a group of people had to pretend to be terrorists, and then the police were supposed to, how they would respond to a terrorist attack. So what do these terrorists do? They shout Allah Akbar. None of them are Muslim, but they shout Allah Akbar, so the police thinks this is what a terrorist would be. Now, these are the kind of associations that are made. Now, you can keep on saying, well, the majority of so-called terrorist incidents did not involve Muslims, etc., etc. But that's not the logic anymore. That's not the grammar that is putting these things together. The way that police training circulates, it repeats those kind of best practices. Or take, for example, a statement made by senior officials in the People's Republic of China, or in India, or the United States, or the United Kingdom. And you can play a game of who's who, because they're saying maybe the same thing about the security threat around Muslimness. So even countries who cannot agree on anything manage to make almost the same statements around that. So I think what I would say to you is this, that there are two main impetuses for this. One of the arguments that I've been making is this, that what we've been seeing is a process of a reassertion of a Muslim political identity and a desire for political agency. And Islamophobia, if it does nothing else, it is completely about suppressing any political agency for Muslimness. And some of these things have happened not because of a response to Muslims, but often a response to their own internal crisis. So when you see, the first report on Islamophobia comes out in the UK, it responds to a crisis in Europe and North America, which I've called about the crisis of whiteness. And much of this kind of white supremacy and white revanchism is really about why is it that we are no longer center of the world. And the reason why we're no longer center of the world is because these Muslims are preventing us from being who we really are. Now, this is the discourse you'll find in India. This is the discourse you'll find in Burma. So the Muslim becomes the explanation why this society cannot be what is cannot fulfill its destiny. And that has now become fairly widespread. So you have a situation in the world right now that people who may vote for Trump or Modi or Macron, or who may support the oppression of Palestinians, who may support the policies of the Chinese Communist Party, all of them are basically examples of now carrying out a kind of ethno-nationalist detail, including, of course, Muslim regimes. Wherever you see the cultivation of ethno-nationalism, you then encounter the challenge of Muslimness, because ethno-nationalists see in Muslims something which goes beyond their vision of the ethnos of the nation. And I think it's important that we recognize that every single Islamophobic attempt is driven by the desire by governments to nationalize expressions of Muslimness. They want a French Islam, or they want a Chinese Islam, because the thing that makes Muslimness so difficult for them is that it cannot be contained. And when you see Muslim regimes which carry out this kind of Kemalist agenda, what I call Kemalism, they're doing the same thing to build a Turkish or Egyptian Islam, and saying, well, this Islam should stop at the boundaries of the state which they control. And I think the challenge for them is that, to the extent that Muslims maintain, without over-romanticizing it, but a sense that their affiliation or their bayah is not containable within any national jurisdiction.
Do you think with the idea of nation state, it finds it can't define ummah, the grouping of Muslim that happens, like, and in the Muslim, with all the atrocities happening at their home, they're still worried about what is happening in Palestine. They will be scrambling about what is happening with Rohingya beyond the their priorities would.
Yeah, but this is I think you're absolutely right. But this is what makes the Muslim communities far more political than most other communities right now. One way of thinking about politics or the political is that it is the ability to transcend your own interests. So to give you a very small example of this, if someone loses their job and comes to you and says, I've lost my job, can you help me? That's not political. If someone says, I've seen so-and-so lose their job, I am going to do something about it, that's where politicalness comes into it. So it's a consciousness that goes beyond your ego, in a way. So when people protest for Palestine, they are actually showing and becoming aware of something that goes beyond their narrowly conceived sense of interest, which is imparted to them. Because the argument has always been, why are you talking about Palestine when you should be fixing your drains or getting your rubbish collected or whatever there may be, the problem that you have with the police and local there? Because this shows that they recognize there is a connection between what is happening locally and what is happening in Palestine, what is happening in Kashmir, what is happening to the Rohingya, what is happening to the Uyghurs. There is a thread running through that. And that is a very important way of preserving the notion of humanity itself and human rights, because we value, if you lived in a society where your only concern was what happened to you or your friends or your family, no one would want to live in that society.
If Islamophobia is the grammar of the world order, and what is happening to the world order after, especially after October 7, is that, you feel like, that is collapsing. At least the farce of it has a morality is collapsing. How do you think that, acknowledging Islamophobia could change it?
I think there's two different things here, because I think the genocide that's ongoing is not an interruption of the argument that I made about Islamophobia being the grammar of the world. In fact, it's a demonstration of that. It's very hard to imagine a genocide which has been unfolding for so long in such a public way, eliciting such little active opprobrium from governments and elites who have said to us for almost 100 years that they're the custodians of decency and humanity, etc. Okay, so that's first. And people will say, well, the genocide happened in Rwanda, it happened in Srebrenica. Yes, and the same kind of coalition happened. That these were genocides which happened to people that were not worth it. And the thing that makes it very, very painful now is that you can see this sort of contrast between what is happening how in the Ukraine and what is happening in Palestine. How the suffering of the Ukrainian children and how the suffering of Palestinian children are not even on the same scale. Right? So you would have reports about X number of Ukrainians being killed. And you can have 10 times, 100 times that, and it doesn't register in a way. So one of the things that it shows is the way that we're discriminating between those that we can grieve for, or we should grieve for, is determined not by the pain, but the way that Islamophobia draws the boundary of those that are grievable and those are not grievable. So when Ukraine was invaded, in the United Kingdom, all schools and public buildings had the yellow and blue flag. They were flying that, right? Departments of Slavonic studies would have the Ukrainian flag on top of them. I have yet to see any university in the UK where they have Middle Eastern studies departments, there are more of them, flying the Palestinian flag. I've seen school children being sent home or disciplined or threatened with expulsions or all kinds of things for wearing badges with watermelons on them. I've never heard of this happening to situations where people were wearing yellow and blue as signifying Ukraine. Now, the point that I'm making with this comparison is simply to show that when we talk about the collapse of that order, the grammar of Islamophobia contributes to that order, but we are at a stage where if there is no kind of, if the old order is collapsing, but the new one hasn't been born, and that's what makes it a very dangerous time. And part of it is that I would argue that the lack of awareness of Islamophobia among many, many Muslim communities, certainly among Muslim elites who are contributing to it, and not realizing that they are actually contributing to a destruction that will ultimately engulf them as well. So we have a situation where we've seen the forces of Islamophobia, whether they're in India or the United States or Europe or China or Burma, or involved in the occupation of Palestine, or involved in the occupation of Kashmir, wherever they may be. They can have converged. They coordinate in many different levels. However, the Muslim response has been almost delegated to ordinary Muslims, because the failure of most Muslim governments to recognize or think that this is a problem for them. Yes, they will make speeches, but they will never take that further than that, or actually look at the fact that they are involved in this. And this shouldn't surprise us, because, again, the grammar of Islamophobia is why some of these regimes have these kinds of governments, why these regimes themselves are Islamophobic. Regimes exist. Governments which are accountable, which deal with public, are far more likely to be pro-Palestinian and support Palestine, because they understand that the people understand that. You take the example of Pakistan. In many ways, Pakistan, since 1947 has been pro-Palestinian, certainly among the population, but the government will not allow even pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Pakistan. It can't go much further because it feels weaker. So you already have that kind of a quasi-martial law system preventing expressions of support and solidarity to Palestinians and the Uyghurs, etc., against places where there is a degree of public opinion, where governments have to respond to the public in relation to the question of Palestine. So for all sorts of reasons, it is the sort of custodians of liberal democracies support dictatorships because they're easier for them to deal with. So when the uprising happened in Bangladesh, which overthrew Sheikh Hasina, apart from the Bangladesh flag, they were also flying Palestinian flags in many of the demonstrations. Now that itself tells you something about how the local and the global, the national and the regional are connected. And it is political consciousness that is aware of that. What is missing is the ability to turn these connections and these intuitions into something more solid and firmer. And that is the work of political education. I think, people are aware, but they don't feel they have enough information. They don't feel that they are consolidated in their awareness. And that, I think, is the work that needs to be done to be able to connect that. So, for example, many people in India will say, we don't want to talk about Islamophobia, we'll talk about communalism. Because it's very, very specific. This is not the same thing. And my argument is not the same thing, but there's a family resemblance here. And if you don't understand the family resemblance, you will not be able to find, if you can't diagnose a problem properly, you have no hope of finding a solution for it, or even thinking about a solution.
For this, I'll ask the same question I asked earlier. Can a person be a Muslim ally and still be Islamophobic? Or can a person not be an anti-Muslim and still be an Islamophobic person?
I mean, some of the best Islamophobes you'll meet, and I'm sure this will probably mean nothing to your audience, but we've seen a very good example of that. People can be Muslims and be Islamophobes very easily. Okay? There's a category that was introduced, popularized by a journalist from Iran. West toxification it translates into. People who are so completely intoxicated with the idea of the West that they think that Westernization is the way to proceed. The thing is that Westernization has been constructed to mean de-Islamicization. So if your question is, can a Muslim from whatever background be in a
Muslim, it can be a left liberal and maybe the most progressive person in the room.
Yes, I don't think the thing with Islamophobia is that it doesn't map onto the right-left distinction in the same way. But it's not just Islamophobia. I think it's a broader problem here. The distinction that we use in political analysis between left and right is something that arises from the French Revolution. That's how the terms emerge. I would argue, and I've written this, that the Iranian Revolution has basically altered those contours in relation to the question of Muslimness. In most issues, you can read who is a leftist, who's a rightist, by their attitudes to this or that, or, for example, ethnic minorities or human rights or whatever, right? But when it comes to Muslimness, it is impossible to read exactly that, because you may find people who are leftists in every single thing, except when it comes to expressions, autonomy from Muslimness. Similarly, you may find, ironically, people who are rightist on a lot of things may not be the most hostile to Muslimness, though that is changing now, because with this kind of convergence of white revanchism, Hindutva, xeno-chauvinism, and these various ethno-nationalist discourse, the right is becoming more and more Islamophobic. I mean, it always had a head start. The left is Eurocentric. The Eurocentric left is fully bought into Islamophobia, whether it's in reading, whether it's in Tehran or Cairo or Karachi or Kuala Lumpur, it's fully there. The so-called liberals of the world who are there, again, to the extent that they're Eurocentric, they will find it very easy to be Islamophobic. I very rarely make definitive statements about Muslimness because I don't think I have the knowledge to do so. But one thing that I'm pretty certain about, whatever else Muslimness may be, it is at least skeptical of ethno-nationalism, if not hostile to it. And that doesn't mean that there isn't, Muslims don't fall into ethno-nationalism or they don't have racist attitudes, but nearly all of them are things that are, can be and should be contested. Because ultimately, if you ask them, Muslimness has to transcend any particular ethnicity. And this is why all the Orientalist writing about Muslims tends to replace them with ethno-nationalist labels. So they'll talk about, this is an Arab Muslim, this is the Arab Islam, this is the Turkish Islam, this is this Islam, this is Indian Islam, or whatever. This is the kind of ethnicization of Islam.
One thing would be, if we can't, as Muslims, if we can't rely on this world order because its grammar is itself problematic, and to have a new order, there is no new order yet. The chaos in between, which is costing lives. I mean, the Rohingyas. I mean, in Europe, you're talking about civil rights, but the apathy towards the genocide in Rohingya, Sudan, you take Uyghur and Palestine. That apathy coming from UN organs or like Western countries, these liberal democracies. How do you engage with that? You feel so failed in the system. How do you engage with them? And is there any progress to make?
There are two kind of answers to this. Firstly, the question is a tactical one, and that means it depends on particular context. And there may be, in particular contexts, certain tools that you can use, certain pathways, certain strategies that you can follow. Right? So it really depends on the context. I think a broader question really is that what is the aim of engaging with this collapsing order, right? And not because, what do you hope to salvage? What do you hope to do? It seems to me that you've already indicated that this is a time of chaos. So the question is that there's a need for a new order. And how that new order comes about really is what how you have a particular correlation of forces. And the thing is this, that how you invent and form the forces that need to be correlated. Right now, I don't think there is a way in which Muslimness has been formed into a meaningful force that can be correlated with other forces to produce a pluriversal world order. Many people talk about, well, if, for example, India gets the veto status in the UN, or if there's one for Africa, etc., all these things, I am not sure these in themselves are going to be productive for the correlation of forces that I'm talking about. Clearly, that's a way of thinking about how can we keep this order going. It's like if your house is crumbling and you think the best thing we can do is repaint over it rather than actually repair it. And the work of repair is often the repair of foundations. So I think while there are tactical measures that can be taken in every single situation, it may mean petitioning choosing one politician rather than another politician, or using this piece of legislation rather than another. It may be different kinds of things. And I don't think anyone has the kind of detailed knowledge to say what needs to be done. But what I do know is that we need to develop a strategic literacy. We need to know how to do these things. People are not born knowing these things. So one thing that we do need to think about is, well, how do you make these differences in these local contexts? But how do you do that without losing sense of the overarching aim that needs to be done? Because otherwise you get consumed into the everyday and you become almost reactive. So you say, right, oh, we've got this new superintendent of police or someone that is a really, really difficult character. We need to get rid of him, and we will try and talk to this person, that person, get him reposted. Okay, that's perfectly legitimate to do this, right? But if you are going to say, right, we will do this time, and the next person comes in is as bad or worse, you are constantly just responding and reacting to situations. You're not actually changing the conversation, you're not changing the structure. So one of the difficulties is that we need to be strategic in relation to structures, not just individuals. That's because we still have, for the most part, a theory based on methodological individualism, which argues, and you can see this, that the reason why we have this Islamophobic regime in this country is because we have one particular leader who has made, and if we had another leader, this would not have happened. And we all like to believe this to be the case. It makes it so much easier. But I will give you an example of Britain. in the last, sort of 5-6 years, Britain had about 3 prime ministers. And they were very different, there's Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak. We could also put Theresa May, 4, right? If you met them, you would see these are 4 very different personalities, very different people. They're not, you couldn't imagine them in the same space together. They were all prime ministers, but invariably they're all, in relation to Islamophobia, there was hardly any difference between them in the actual policies. So you could not guarantee me that if you got rid of this police inspector, superintendent, or whatever, that the next one will be any better. Because the problem isn't just it's who becomes a police officer, how they are socialized into particular values. So if we don't recognize that, we end up with thinking that all we can do is these tactics after tactics after tactics, and we lose that kind of bigger picture. So the real thing about is developing strategic literacy, which gives you skills, and skills of struggle are really difficult and hard. They're not just polite. And I know you know this, and I think many people know this, but I think many people still need to know this. But you also need to have the skill to see how this connects up with the broader strategic goal. And that is something that I think is really, really important to develop.
Have you been, I don't know, is there any department in the world where, I know there would be initiatives to look into Islamophobia, but is there actual social science departments which is like, okay, I need to look at this?
Why would there be? If you're living in an Islamophobic world, why would you have a department committed to ending Islamophobia? This is one of the problems we have of the agency kind of thing. So we, for example, we have a lot of talk saying that we need big tech companies to reform themselves. We need the media to reform itself. Who is going to reform it? Why do you think they're producing Islamophobia? So I would say to you, there is, as far as I'm aware, there are people, isolated caravan of scholars and activists working on these topics. They're often not valued for that work they do. But there, as far as I'm aware, there's no department, and it would be very difficult to have a department of Islamophobia studies. You can't even have, you can have...
Do we have a definition that is agreed by all the people?
But even the definition can't be. But the thing is, the thing about the definition becomes a fetish. Everyone thinks they have to have a definition. It's like a flag in a football team. If you're not a scholar, if you don't have your own definition of Islamophobia, it becomes it's nonsensical. But you can have in universities of the global north Islamic studies departments without a Muslim.
Yeah.
Easily. You can't have, in the United States, a department of African American studies without someone of African American heritage. And the reason why you have departments of African American studies is because of civil rights forced that issue to become something that needed to be recognized. And at the same time, there's been constant attempts to try and close those departments down or marginalize them, etc. So it is political power and political mobilization, which means that the top universities like Harvard and Princeton compete to have the best African American studies department. I do not think there are many universities, even among, the sort of in Islamistan, where you have this competition. We will have the best Islamophobia studies department. So this is the paradox. We have to create the tools. So when you were asking what are the tools, we don't even have this forge to make the tools at this point in time. And that's what we have. They're no ready-made. We have to make the tools. So we are at the stage of tool making rather than tool using. And that's a big challenge, because the tools that are available for us are not always going to be very suitable. They might help us immediately because listen, if you need to hammer a nail and you can't find a hammer, you might use a rock. You might use something else. But having a hammer is better to hammer a nail, right? So we're at a stage where we may have to, put nails in something, and we don't have a hammer, so we're using these rocks which keep breaking. So what we need to do, and you can keep doing this, but eventually you run out of rocks or your hands will blister. Eventually what you need to do is make a hammer. And that's the tool-making stage. And I think a lot of the work on Islamophobia, you asked me this question before, I think it became focused on tool using without recognizing the need for tool making. And that's where the real challenge is for us.
Is the conversation moving forward about this? Any shelter where we can have this conversation? Because even for a workshop where Islamophobia is discussed, you get gaslighted for okay, you're part of the problem, so you can't get a lot of people come together and agree on what is Islamophobia. A lot of conversation what we would have is about hate, but Islamophobia is a mundane structural thing that is a climate. This is the best way I feel
I think that's a good way of talking about it, and this is why I was very, very critical about talking about it as hate. Hate suggests a degree of passionate commitment rather than this mundane, ordinary day thing. It's like, people use it to some extent. It is, you could argue, it's that tool using because there's legislation against hate speeches in some jurisdictions. But when the tool that you're using actually becomes the thing that you do. So rather than saying, this is what I need, you say, well, I've got a tool for it. It's like if I said to you, I need you to cut a piece of wood. And you say, well, I've got a hammer so I can nail something. That's not helpful. So we build, rather than cutting the wood, you end up, because you've got the hammer, doing nailing. And I think that's the kind of metaphor I would use to explain exactly that. So we talk about hate because in some jurisdictions it might be helpful to do. And this is what I was trying to say, that we have to keep there's a tactical, I've got nothing against people talking about hate or anti-Muslim racism or whatever in particular situations. But then don't confuse that with the strategic goals. And because the problem with that is you're reinscribing Islamophobia. And one of the challenges that we have is that a lot of Islamophobia studies ends up being Islamophobic. And that's a big thing to worry about. But there are organizations, the the Islamophobia Studies Association, Research Association, is trying to sort of put together a scholarly organization where you can have scholars from different parts of the world putting it together. And we need to build on that. But there's another temptation with these things, and this is everyone then, not only does everyone have a definition, then you have lots of these multiplication of groups who don't talk to each other, et cetera, because Islamophobia hasn't reached the level of a general literacy in the culture. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about. I think the question about genocide, and I agree with you, I think the worst thing that could happen, well, not the worst thing, obviously, the second worst thing could happen, is that whatever happens afterwards, Muslims forget what happened and what is still happening. So even if Gaza and the West Bank and the occupation of Palestine quieten down, even if by some, some unlikely sequence of events, it is clear that Tel Aviv will not be allowed to do what it's doing, and there will be freedom. There'll be a free Palestine within weeks or something like that, let's say, yeah? Inshallah, it will happen, but whether it happens in weeks or not doesn't matter. There is still genocide going on here. There's genocide going on in the Uyghurs. There's genocide going in Burma. And I think it's important for us to recognize that Islamophobia isn't going to be stopped until it is stopped. So what would be the worst thing would be that people think, Alhamdulillah, the genocide is stopped, Islamophobia is over. And that will be because they haven't understood Islamophobia, its depth, and how it shapes not just these local events, but the very condition of possibility these events occur in the way they do. So I think this is very important where, activists and others, every community needs a keeper of archives, a keeper of our memories, and especially subalternized communities because their history is constantly being written out. And for me, one of the biggest challenges throughout the Muslim Ummah is a failure to normalize and internalize the history of our community, of the Ummah. Nearly every Muslim child will be able to name you, tell you something about the stories of the Prophet, the companions. But if you ask them to name historical figures other than those related to the early formation of the Prophet, there'll be hardly any. And whatever history exists, it exists in a very kind of, this was a good king, this was a bad king, this is a good man, this is a bad man, and so we learn very little from that, and we don't have our own stories to tell. And that means that the reservoir of resources that we have to think shrinks. We never think, well, what did Muslims in similar positions do? And we may agree with what they've done, or we say, actually, they shouldn't have done this, they should have done that. We don't have those resources. So we end up trying to read ourselves through the history of others. And certainly in the case of many of those histories are based on the expulsion of Muslimness.
We are trying to define our stories. So we are an organization.
Yeah. But I think this is a really, really valuable work to do that, because you need to define those things as a kind of, figures like Malcolm X and Sayyid Qutb were never really put together in a way. And nearly every early Shariati, all of these have always talked about the importance of history. That having historical consciousness is an adjunct to having political consciousness. And historical consciousness helps you get away from the kind of problems contained with it only having a sacral understanding of the world. So if we know what Ibn Taymiyyah did or said, or why he said those things, what was the context of that, it makes us better understand not just him, but some of those things that arrive from that. So in a way, we are involved in this kind of contextualization that allows us to see how we came to be. And that is a prelude to the formation of an agency. So right now, as I said before, there isn't a force that Muslims can correlate on. There is the difficulty of expressing Muslim agency. And that has both strategic and immediate effects. The virtual collapse of the Pakistani state has had, in my opinion, untold effects on the treatment of Muslims in India. If the Pakistani state had been stronger, more cogent, it would have acted as some kind of break. I don't want to romanticize this either, but there is absolutely no doubt that you can see how these things move around. If there would be the Palestinians would not be suffering a genocide if, there was a unity in West Asia among Muslim societies, Muslim political societies. I will put it more counterfactually. Even in 1917, if the Ottoman state had not been dismantled, it is very unlikely the Palestinians would find themselves homeless. So all of these configurations tell us about different kinds of possibilities and things. So I think it's important that we don't forget the role of history and then historical imagination to think of a new future. History is not about the past. The history is about the possibility of a future. And if you want to have a future in which there is Muslimness in a better condition, then you need to have an understanding of a critical understanding of the history that brought these things as they are now. And that will help enrich our political analysis, which will enrich our strategic visions.
Thanks so much.